Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. I'm Florence Reed. Apart from the Olympic opening ceremony with its drag queen Last Supper, perhaps the biggest scandal of this year's Olympic Games has been the inclusion of two athletes in the female boxing category. They are Imane Khelif of Algeria and Lin Yuting of Taiwan, both of whom have XY chromosomes. They both failed gender tests at the World Championships run by the International Boxing Association, but now, new regulator, the International Olympic Committee, has allowed them to compete, and so we are seeing them on our television screens. Just this morning, we witnessed Imane Khelif of Algeria in a shocking victory over Angela Carini of Italy in the 66-kilo category, in which Carini tossed the match in protest, shouting in Italian, "It's not fair." She left the ring, and Khelif was given an automatic victory after only 45 seconds of boxing. Of course, there is much confusion and noise around the nature of this case. It is not simply a culture war around trans women in sport. There is something more scientific and certainly more complex at play. And so, to deal with those many complexities, I have invited Tommy Lundberg to join us today. He is the Assistant Senior Lecturer at the Division of Clinical Physiology at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, and part of a massive research group looking at specifically sex variations in sport and how they might impact the Olympics. I just would like to get your initial reaction to this because, of course, this feels like quite a momentous occasion in the world of the Olympics. For someone to end their Olympic dream, to give up on their hopes of a medal, is a really grave indictment of what is happening in the match that we saw today. So tell me about why this has happened. Why would Angela Carini do this?
It was quite dramatic to see the sudden ending of the game after just 40 seconds or so, and clearly she abandoned the game. We don't know the reason for it, but obviously we have seen and heard many speak about this issue, that it's unfair to let athletes who have failed sex test and have male physiology to compete in women's sport, and maybe especially in women's boxing, where there's also a safety concern.
So let's dig into the science behind this, because you say they failed the kind of sex assessment that has to be done prior to a boxing match. And yet, why is Khelif still able to compete in the Olympics if they have failed this test?
They failed the sex test or sex verification procedure governed by the International Boxing Association. But clearly here in Paris, there are other rules in play. And I heard the spokesperson from the IOC say that these two athletes are female in the passport, so they are therefore eligible to compete.
Previously in the Boxing World Championships, we had the International Boxing Association head saying that a DNA test had proven that they had XY chromosomes, these two athletes in question. What does that actually mean? Why would an XY chromosome appear in the genetics of someone who is female on their passport?
There are rare occasions where people are born with disorders of sex development. So you can have the male XY chromosome, and obviously then your genetic sex is male and the intended body plan is male. But there are some disturbances in the normal development of sex organs and sex glands, which can lead to ambiguous external genitalia, for example, which then occasionally leads to some infants actually being mistaken as girls instead of boys. Now, obviously, we don't know the exact conditions of these athletes because, as far as I know, this has not been released, what their exact medical condition is. All we know is that, according to the IBA, they failed the sex verification procedure due to XY chromosomes, and it was also released in a statement yesterday that they have also determined that they have a male performance advantage and therefore were not allowed to compete.
This is where it gets quite complex, though, because of course there is this other separate conversation regarding transgender women in women's sports, aka somebody who's born biologically male and makes a transition to become kind of socially females, and the obvious kind of connotations of that, which is that a mediocre sportsman might actually be able to excel and even get to the highest levels of women's sports by transitioning. So there's an issue of kind of fair play there. This is a different question, though, isn't this? It's a completely separate issue. It's a biological one of the issue of intersex, which is what's happened with Caster Semenya, the South African distance runner who beating female competition and then it turned out had high levels of testosterone in these kind of DNA tests. And so these are two separate and distinct problems facing the Olympic Committee and sports more widely. But do they relate? There's some sort of crossover between the two of them because, of course, we've had figures who are very active in advocating for female-only spaces and female-only sports, speaking also on this as a kind of crossover issue or something that might become a blurred line. So where do those two intersect?
Yeah, there are some similarities and crossover, but there are also some important differences between the transgender issue and the DSD or intersex issue. Now, the crossover or similarity is, of course, that we're discussing here whether or not these athletes have benefited from male development and male physiology and having undergone male puberty. Now, it was determined in a long process with the known cases in track and field, such as Caster Semenya, that these athletes have undergone male development and undergone male puberty, and that this gives them the performance advantage in terms of stature and muscle mass, height, etc. All these biological factors that explain why males have a performance advantage over females. Now, this is obviously the case with transgender women as well, that they have undergone male puberty and male development. So the similarity here is that we're talking about having a potential male performance advantage in female sport. And the difference is that obviously transgender women, they have recognized this early on. They know their birth sex and they face a potential decision to go through a transition, and they understand that this may have implications for sporting eligibility, whereas for some of these DSD cases they have been raised as girls and identified as girls and have been in girl sport.
So a little more about this DSD condition as opposed to a transgender person who makes the choice to transition. DSD could be something that was only noticed later in life, you just mentioned there. Can you just explain a little more about how the condition might present itself and what it really means to have DSD?
Yeah, if we talk sort of more generally about the issue that has been within sports, it has concerned mainly a specific DSD called 5-ARD, which is basically like an enzyme that converts testosterone. So this essentially means that your external genitalia doesn't develop and come out as it should, which essentially means that you can be identified and as a girl at birth, and it may in some cases take all until the years around puberty when you don't get your menstruation, or you can notice this more masculine development of the body. And so sometimes this is detected around pubertal ages rather than at or around birth.
Well, forgive the very kind of naive question, but how would having DSD or this kind of sex difference impact the body of someone who has grown up supposedly female?
Yeah, this was discussed and analyzed in detail in the process with Caster Semenya, and the case went to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and the experts there witnessed about the condition and the scientific consensus at this time, and basically concluded that this condition mainly affects the development of the genitalia, but also things like body hair and stuff. But they concluded that in terms of the attributes that we associate with better sports performance, such as the more male development of muscle mass, etc., that is intact in these athletes. So in terms from a sports advantage perspective, they concluded that these athletes should be viewed as males in that sense. And that's also why World Athletics at that time wanted to restrict these athletes from competing.
So when we watch Khelif and Carini fighting there in a boxing ring, of course there is the instant reaction, which is Khelif is significantly larger than Carini. Your human response to that is a kind of, well, this just simply isn't fair. But specifically scientifically, what can we say about Khelif's physicality versus Carini's that would put them at an unfair advantage over the Italian boxer, that isn't just the same as we would have, say, in basketball, where one competitor is taller than the other and can reach the basket much more easily, and we just say, well, shucks, that's the way it goes. In most sport, we do accept that there's a certain amount of physical difference between players, and it gives them one advantage over another. So why is this different when we watch those two boxing?
Well, I think it's important in a question like this to look more broadly at the average differences between males and females, because obviously you can have female boxers that are exceptional and are better than some male boxers. But generally, if you have two equally good, one male and one female boxer, then there is a very clear performance advantage of being male in terms of physique, strength and power, punching power, wingspan, etc. Many factors that are important for performance. And this is the reason why we have separate categories to begin with. And we have a protected category for females, and it is protected from the male performance advantage, just as age categories are protected from the benefit of advanced maturation, for example.
How would the kind of punch of a boxer who had gone through male puberty, for example, differ to the punch of a woman?
There are some simulations in the laboratory where you simulate a punching movement and measure the power output, and it has been reported that males punch on average 160% greater power than females. So there is a clear male performance advantage in boxing and in many other sports, but obviously the magnitude of performance advantage differs between sports. But I think it's safe to say that in a sport like boxing, there is a huge advantage of being male compared with being an equally good female athlete. And you also have the special case here in some sports, such as boxing, where there is also some safety concerns because of the physical combat between athletes.
Yes, I suppose these high contact sports, whether it's martial arts or boxing or rugby, are being focused on specifically because it's so visceral to watch the difference in size and power played out on the kind of stage of the Olympics. Let's just speak a little more about the specifics. Testosterone is often mentioned here in this conversation. Levels of testosterone are used to indicate whether or not somebody has gone through male puberty. But there is also, of course, high testosterone women, females, who are born entirely female and just have high levels of testosterone. Where do we draw the line here? Because it starts to get very difficult if we have high testosterone leveled women and then these more complex categories of intersex where you might actually find that it's very blurred.
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a few testosterone thresholds used in sports. In the past, used to be 10 nanomoles from the IOC. It was then lowered to 5 nanomoles from several organizations, and some organizations now even have 2.5 nanomoles. But these, both the 2.5 and 5 nanomoles, healthy women, they never exceed these thresholds. So these thresholds were put in place essentially to be able to discriminate between male physiology and female physiology, essentially now. Obviously now with more data from studies on transgender individuals, for example, we now know that lowering your testosterone levels in adulthood, even down to complete female levels, doesn't really remove this performance advantage. So that's why many now suggest that you should not look at testosterone levels per se, but rather whether or not a person have gone through male development.
Mm-hmm. And how can we test for this practically? If you're the IOC, what's the best course of action to make sure that these boundary cases are tested fairly? Because of course the difficulty is here, it's a deeply private and often sensitive issue. What can the IOC do to make sure that this is fairly adjudicated?
Well, one of the approaches used that has been used in the past, and some organizations still use it, is to use a simple cheek swab to test for chromosomes, to sort of screen athletes that in the women's sport that have potentially XY chromosomes. And those very few cases that you will find, they can then undergo further examination to determine the exact nature of the condition. So that would be a very, very accurate test and very easy test. It would take less than a minute per athlete, and it's not intrusive on your privacy in the sense that there's no need for a physical examination in that sense.
This is the problem here, is what happens when that swab comes back and it's XY. Is that person who has lived their life entirely as female now technically a male?
Well, that person has the chromosome setup of a male, and it would require further testing to see whether or not this person has benefited from male puberty. We have some conditions such as complete androgen insensitivity syndrome case, where you produce normal testosterone levels from the testicles in the healthy, normal male range, but the body can't use this testosterone, which means that you don't undergo the typical male development during puberty.
So it would be possible for there to be testosterone, high levels of testosterone present, but the body is unable to convert that into the additional muscle mass and the rest that we've discussed that would confer an advantage in the sporting arena.
Yes, that's one of the known DSD conditions, is androgen insensitivity syndrome, and for example in track and field, the World Athletics, they do allow those athletes to compete in the women's category because they have determined that it doesn't constitute a clear male performance advantage since the body can't use testosterone. But the athletes that have been restricted from participating, they have had this other condition, the 5-ARD, where the testicles produce testosterone and the body can also use the testosterone effectively.
In the case, though, of Semenya and Khelif, these individuals who we're speaking about who do obviously have some advantage from the levels of testosterone in their sporting category, what should we do with those athletes? Because the natural question is, if they cannot compete in the female category, should they be competing in the male category? Do they need a third category? Can they not compete at all? Because, of course, Caster Semenya probably wouldn't fare very well running against male athletes, and Khelif probably also wouldn't fare very well boxing against male boxers. So what happens to those people? Where are we expecting them to go when it comes to their sporting career?
Well, it's a very difficult situation for the athletes and for the sports governing bodies, because obviously most people and most sports bodies, they want to be inclusive and include people in the category they identify best with. But sometimes that clashes with the principle of fair and safe competitions. And right now we're seeing different solutions to this. Obviously here in the Olympics, these athletes are now competing, but in other sports, they would not be allowed to compete. And these boxers were not allowed to compete last year in the World Championships. But we're seeing more and more international sports federations now moving to a more restricted female category that does not allow for the male performance advantage. But we also see some organizations still relying on testosterone suppression for 1 or 2 years, etc. So we're in a situation now where there's no general consensus between different sports. We're still seeing different solutions, and whatever choice the sports make, it's a difficult one, and there is no perfect solution here. You cannot reach full inclusion and fair and safe competition at the same time. Unfortunately.
I am getting a sense, though, that the conversation is being somewhat derailed by its adjacency to the transgender debate in sport. It's become such a culture war, that particular question, with activists on both sides, that it feels almost that this very particularly scientific sporting quandary is being lost in the noise of this kind of culture war that surrounded the transgender question for so many years. Do you sense that as a scientist who's working on these issues? Is it something you resent, this association with the question of transgender people in sport, or is it something you embrace?
I mean, you are right. It's a sensitive, emotive topic. There are strong opinions. There is activism and sometimes ideology involved. And it's very difficult, I find, to have meaningful conversations on social media, for example, on this. But I think it's important, and there are many academics who don't want to speak on this issue at all. And we know that athletes and people within sports organizations have been essentially forbidden to talk freely on this issue, which is not good. So I think it's important to have the conversation, even if it's a difficult one, because obviously this is one of the major issues in sports right now. And it is very important that we continue to ensure equal opportunities and fair competition for female athletes.
Are there other advantages conferred through male puberty? I know this might sound like a slightly strange question, but if you look at the top ranks of non-physical sports, say chess or poker, it's often a group of men right at the top of these elite sport or non-physical sports. Why is that? Is that something to do with the male brain? Does testosterone make people more ambitious, more competitive? Is there something else there that can't quite be measured through this DNA diagnostic testing?
Yeah, so that may vary a little bit between different sports. There certainly are effects of testosterone on male development also on the brain and psychological traits, etc. But there are also historical and cultural differences. Sometimes the women event in a certain sport discipline is much younger than the male discipline, and you don't have the same history and tradition and culture, and also the economic situation may differ between sexes in male versus female sport. And we often see that in newer sports that the male versus female performance difference narrows a little bit and then becomes more stable after the sport has been sort of going on for many years. We see that in some of the older sports, that it has been essentially stable now since the 1980s or so, which indicates that the remaining gap between men and women is due to the biology. But then you have some newer sport where there is also much more boys and men competing if you compare with girls, and that's also going to contribute to a gap at the top.
Looking forward, if the IOC does not amend these rules around testosterone levels and DSD, what effect will it have on women's sport going forwards, looking to the next Olympics and the Olympics after that? How will women's sport change if the rules stay the same?
Well, it is a clear threat on fair and safe sport for female athletes. Now, I think everyone realizes that this is a difficult question because not everyone is going to be happy, and you kind of have to prioritize between inclusion and fairness. And some sports governing bodies have realized this and made a transparent decision. Now, unfortunately, the IOC has not made up their mind. They've released a very loose framework some years ago that many international sports federations have already abandoned. And so I think the IOC needs to show stronger leadership and governance of the Olympics and on sports in general on this question. I would still, predict that it's going to be more synchronized between sports, probably eventually in the future. But we're probably around some kind of peak right now where we still see different actions from different sports and from different governing bodies.
Do you think protests like that of Carini, the Italian boxer that we've just witnessed this morning, will have an effect on this conversation, on this debate?
I certainly think it can have an effect, and what the media is reporting is also having an effect. My interpretation of many, or my impression of many sports governing bodies, is that they are actually quite concerned and about what the media is writing on these issues, because they want to be seen as a organization who upholds fair competition for women, but they also want to be seen as inclusive. So they're put in a difficult situation, but we're all facing difficult situation in life, and if you're a governing body, your primary issue is to govern the sport in an appropriate manner, and then just have to deal with the fact that it may be difficult, but they still need to show strong leadership on this issue.
Tommy, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Tommy Lundberg, a sports scientist and a researcher who's specialised in the inner workings of the IOC, speaking there to the fact that this is a complex issue. It doesn't feel like quite the same binary as the transgender women in sport question, which we've discussed on this channel many times before. And yet it is an issue that, of course, crosses over into the question of what it really means to be a man or a woman. What does it mean to have fair sport at all? And really, how far are we allowed to go before inclusion defies meritocracy? Thanks for watching. This was UnHerd.